Mark is 34 years old. He has friends with full sleeves, friends with quotes on their ribs, friends who say tattoos are memories, identity, art. Mark has none, not because he hates tattoos, not because he's scared of needles, not because he's judging anyone. He's just never felt the pull, and that confuses people. They ask him all the time, "Why don't you get one? Not even something small? You don't want something meaningful?" Mark usually shrugs and says, "I just don't feel like it." But that's not the real reason. The real reason started long before tattoos ever came up. Mark grew up in a house where permanence mattered, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, practical way. Things were meant to last. Clothes were worn until they wore out. Furniture stayed for years. Decisions weren't rushed. You didn't change things just because you were bored. So his brain learned an early rule. If something is permanent, you think about it deeply. You don't do it for emotion. You don't do it for a phase. You don't do it to prove anything. That rule stuck. When Mark was a kid, adults around him valued restraint. They didn't announce how they felt all the time. They didn't decorate their identity. They didn't turn the body into a message. Your character showed in how you behaved, not how you looked. So Mark learned to keep things internal. If he felt strongly about something, he didn't need to show it on the outside. If something mattered, he didn't need to display it. Meaning was private. As he got older, he noticed something. People around him used tattoos to mark moments. Breakups, loss, growth, identity shifts. Mark processed moments differently. He absorbed them. He remembered them. He carried them internally. For him, turning a feeling into something permanent on the skin felt unnecessary, not wrong, just unnecessary. And that difference matters psychologically. People who don't get tattoos often have a strong internal identity. Their sense of self doesn't rely on visible symbols. They don't feel the need to anchor emotions externally to make them real. Their brain already knows who they are. Mark also grew up watching people change their minds. What felt important at 20 didn't feel the same at 30. What felt like "this is me forever" quietly faded. So his brain learned another rule: feelings change. Identity evolves, skin doesn't. That doesn't make him indecisive, it makes him future-oriented. When Mark thinks about permanence, his mind jumps ahead. How will I feel about this later? Will this still represent me? What if I outgrow it? That's not fear, that's long-term thinking. Some people live in the present emotionally. Mark lives slightly ahead. Another thing shaped him early. Mark grew up in an environment where attention wasn't always positive. Standing out could attract judgment, questions, assumptions. So he learned to be comfortable blending in, not invisibility, neutrality. Neutrality felt safe. That doesn't mean he lacks confidence. It means his confidence doesn't need to be loud. For people like Mark, the body is not a billboard, it's a boundary, and boundaries matter deeply to them. Psychologically, people who avoid tattoos often have a strong sense of bodily autonomy and personal privacy. Their body feels like a private space, not a canvas for public interpretation. Once something is on your skin, it invites opinions. What does it mean? Why that? Does it represent something? Mark doesn't want to explain himself that much. Not because he's secretive, because he doesn't feel obligated. Another layer is control. Tattoos remove the option to undo. And people like Mark value optionality. They like knowing they can change direction. They like knowing they're not locked into past versions of themselves. This doesn't mean they avoid commitment in life. They commit deeply to people, to work, to values, but they're selective about irreversible decisions, especially ones tied to identity. There's also a social piece most people miss. Mark noticed something early on. When people get tattoos, others start reading them, making assumptions, building stories. Tough, rebel, creative, risk-taker. Mark doesn't like being pre-labeled. He wants to be understood through interaction, not appearance. so he leaves the surface quiet. Silence gives him control over how he's perceived. Another reason tattoos never pulled him is validation. Mark doesn't feel a need to externalize meaning to make it count. A memory doesn't become more important because it's inked. Growth doesn't become real because it's visible. Pain doesn't need a symbol to be honored. For some people, tattoos help process emotions. For others, processing happens internally. Neither is better. They're just different nervous systems. Mark's brain is wired toward internal regulation. He sits with feelings. He reflects. He integrates. He doesn't need a marker to move on. There's also something subtle about control over pain. Some people choose tattoos as a way to reclaim pain, to turn discomfort into meaning. Mark doesn't avoid pain, but he doesn't ritualize it either. If something hurts, he lets it hurt. If something matters, he remembers it. No ceremony needed. As tattoos became more common, Mark felt more certain in his choice, not because he wanted to be different, but because trends made him more cautious. When something becomes popular, his brain slows down. He doesn't rush into shared symbols. He doesn't like mass meaning. He wants his identity to stay unbranded. Even now, when people pressure him, he feels no urgency. He doesn't feel behind. He doesn't feel incomplete. He doesn't think, maybe one day. His body feels finished to him, and that's the part people don't understand. For people like Mark, not getting a tattoo is not absence. It's a decision. It comes from growing up valuing restraint, from processing life internally, from thinking long-term, from protecting personal space, from not needing identity to be visible to feel real. So when someone asks him again, "Why don't you get one?" he pauses. Because the real answer isn't simple. It's not that he doesn't have stories or pain or meaning. It's that his life already lives inside him, and he never felt the need to write it on his skin. Many Muslims don't get tattoos because their religion forbids it. It's not about personality, trauma, or self-expression. It's a clear religious rule, and people follow it out of faith and respect for their beliefs. No deeper analysis, no psychology behind it. And for others, it's cultural or family values, like believing that men shouldn't have tattoos. Different paths, different reasons. So, if you don't have tattoos, what's your reason? Write it in the comments.